So welcome back from lunch. The next panel is on atrocity, crimes in Ukraine, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. As a reminder, there will be a short question and answer period following the end of the panel. And for our audience, we would ask that you please use the microphone to pose your questions. And also welcome to those online. And for those of you online, please share your questions for the panelists in the YouTube chat. So now I would like to welcome as the moderator for the next panel, a distinguished friend and very dear friend, Professor Emerita Rebecca Cook from the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, who will introduce our distinguished panel. Rebecca.
Thank you, Payam. Payam and others have put together a very distinguished panel. And what we want to do is each of them will speak for 7 minutes. I will introduce their Ukraine-specific activities, of which are many. And then they will, after they have their 7-minute presentation, they'll speak among themselves, ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up for questions. We'll begin with Mark Ellis, who's the Executive Director of the International Bar Association, and he chairs the UN-created advisory panel on matters related to the Defense Council of the Mechanism for the International Criminal Tribunals. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here and a pleasure to be in Toronto and with many dear friends as well. We've only, as mentioned, been given about 7 minutes, so I'll keep mine quite short. And I thought I would just focus quickly on a two-sided equation when we talk about atrocity crimes. And I was taking some notes this morning as well on just great conversations we had. The first side of this accountability equation is the way atrocity crimes are being documented in Ukraine. Ukraine is not only the most documented war in history, but it's also the technological advances in collecting, disseminating evidence of war crimes that is really unparalleled in modern warfare. Much of that has to given to the credit of the prosecutor. Under the Office of the Prosecutor and the leadership of Prosecutor Kostin, I think Ukraine has really transformed the way in documenting war crimes. What we're seeing happening in Ukraine, we've not seen happen anywhere else in the sense of documenting war crimes. Not only have Ukraine expanded the regional office of the regional units focused on documenting war crimes, but of course has now created this new core international crime evidence database, and that too is quite unique. Ukraine has also been very open about collaborating with Ukrainian NGOs, international NGOs, in bringing together evidence of war crimes. But of course, one of the things that is paramount is the type of evidence that's being gathered eventually has to be at the standard sufficient to be brought and used in a court of law. We all know of the extraordinary amount of pictorial evidence or videos and pictures on social media. That certainly raises the profile of what's happening in Ukraine. But it's very different when you're taking that videos and pictures and trying to turn that into use in legal proceedings. And this is something Ukraine has really been focused on to try to do that. The IBA, the organization that I direct, has been involved with this with our Eyewitness to Atrocities project and app. To date, over 50,000 videos and pictures have been gathered since the war started in Ukraine. And it's been gathered in a way that all of the metadata that's needed in order to present that in a court of law is already embedded in the app. That's really critical here because the pictures and videos can speak for themselves. We've been able to put 45 dossiers, case files together since the beginning of the war, and has filed those with the International Criminal Court, the Commission of Inquiry, and Europol as well. And it also, this type of documentation, this type of technology that's being used is an example of something we saw in a groundbreaking report that we did with Physicians for Human Rights and the Human Rights Initiative, Media Initiative of Ukraine. And that is this widespread and systematic attack against hospitals and health services, which comes into a very bright and disturbing picture when you're able to put together these various gatherings of pictures and videos throughout Ukraine. And that resulted in a groundbreaking report that will also be supplemented on December 15th with additional information. So this is the type of this power of technology that's occurring in Ukraine, and it really is Ukraine is moving this to an entirely different level. I know Wayne and Clint are actively engaged in this area, and I have no doubt talk about this. The second part of this equation, and I'll speak just for a few minutes, is one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it needs to, and that is the trials that are taking place and will continue to take place in Ukraine. 98% of the trials, war crimes trials, atrocity trials, will be done in Ukraine, will not be done internationally. It's not at the ICC, it's not through universal jurisdiction. All of those are part of the puzzle, but the vast majority of trials will be domestic. And why is that important? Because it is such an emphasis on trials domestically, then Ukraine has to get that right. And they have to get that right for two reasons. One, international law requires it. The standards of fairness and impartiality with any trial has to be met. Second, I've always said this will be part of Ukraine's legacy. How the international community perceives Ukraine's ability to undertake these trials, I think, is going to be critical. It's critical for Ukraine. In the best of circumstances, undertaking war crimes trials is challenging and it's daunting. But to do so in the midst of a war can be seen as almost impossible. But I really credit Ukraine for undertaking a really focused initiative to try to make this happen and try to meet these international standards. Once again, I have to say, and I'm not saying this simply because he's sitting in front of me, but the prosecutor was adamant at the start of this war that this part of the equation had to be focused on, that Ukraine needed to make certain that these trials were going to meet these international standards. And I took that to heart when he said that, and we're working with the Ministry of Justice, but particularly the Coordinating Center for Legal Aid. And I think they're doing an extraordinary job and working with them on training defense lawyers in getting the type of knowledge that you have to undertake these types of trials. And then eventually moving into a mentoring system where you actually have Ukrainian defense lawyers that are able to call on and have as part of their team international lawyers as well. And finally, trial observations are taking place right now in Ukraine. For the first set of those were taken over the last 3 months. And they bring a lot of information and insight as to what's being done, the good things and the bad things. But the very fact that Ukraine is committed, and I credit the Ukrainian Bar Association, the International Bar Association is partnering with them on this, to be very open and say, here are some of the areas we need to improve on, here are some of the things we need to be right. That is really critical. It's very rare that domestic national jurisdictions do this, and they're doing this. And finally, I'm hoping that eventually we can increase the knowledge in a public campaign in Ukraine to understand why these trials have to be done consistent with international standards of fairness and impartiality. That again, it's Ukraine's legacy that is at stake. And that, as difficult as that is to do in a war, it's absolutely critical that Ukraine does that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mark. Next up of our distinguished panelists is Yonah Diamond. He is specializing at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights in Montreal in mass atrocity prevention and accountability. He is also the lead author of an independent legal analysis of the Russian Federation's breaches of the Genocide Convention in Ukraine and the duty to prevent. Yonah, over to you.
Thank you, Professor. It's an honor to be here and to see Ukrainian colleagues and colleagues from all over and friends, and particularly inspired by, Andre, your commitment to the triumph of the rule of law over military aggression, and to your commitment to the highest standards in international law, something that I've seen from all my colleagues in the Ukrainian international legal community. And I will just describe some of our efforts at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights to fill in some of the gaps in international accountability efforts, how we complement and reinforce a lot of the discussions that have been going on today in terms of individual prosecutions and trials. And following up on my colleague, the Honorable Erwin Kotler this morning, who spoke of our initiatives to support the Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression, to focus on some ways that we can respond in the moment to atrocities, to prevent atrocities, and to come up with kind of innovative forms of legal analyses that I've been pleased to see have also been used by our Ukrainian colleagues in their efforts. And just to, as was mentioned, I was the lead author of the report that we undertook in May of 2022, following the revelation of the massacre in Bucha. My colleagues from the New Lines Institute in DC approached our organization to collaborate and consult with experts from around the world, from every UN regional group, to ensure the independence of our report, to assess Russia's breaches of the Genocide Convention. And what's often missed, and as Professor Kotler mentioned this morning, is that a standalone breach can be of Article 3C, which is a punishable act of direct and public incitement to genocide. And this is often lost, but our report early on captured exactly how the Russian propaganda at all levels, the highest levels, have continued and have characterized how this war is being waged from the start. And just to lay out some of the steps as to how we found such clear incitement to genocide, starting with some hallmarks of accusation in a mirror, which the war is founded on, accusing the victims of perpetrating crimes that the aggressor plans or is preparing to commit, which were very clearly seen early on. And one need look no further than the telegram and public statements of Dmitry Medvedev, the head of Russia's Security Council and former president, to see how open some of this incitement to genocide is, about erasing Ukraine, about how they're going to experience the same things that the Third Reich experienced, the perpetuation of the dehumanization language, the subhuman terms, the contaminated terms, the existential threats used to describe Ukrainians as a whole, who identify as Ukrainians. And so our report brought this to the fore and demonstrated how this war is being waged, and so makes it to let the world know how soldiers, Russian forces, can commit atrocities with impunity when they see Ukrainians and they're fed this information through a system that is controlled and funneled by the Kremlin to condone and to condition its soldiers and population to commit atrocities, even rewarding certain units after committing mass violence or executions. And so that's just to point out an important aspect of that report. And often in international law, I've noticed throughout our advocacy that terms like individual criminal responsibility and state responsibility are often conflated. And when we talk about breaches of the Genocide Convention, we're talking about different standards. And our hope is that our report and our efforts can underpin Ukraine's efforts to hold Russia accountable as a state, to seek reparations and other remedies at the international level, because accountability is not only about prosecuting individuals, but it's also about initiatives that we've been working on, like repurposing assets to compensate victims of atrocities, working with our colleagues Alan Rock and others on this initiative, and supporting supporting civil society actors in Russia who are opposed to this war. So we've been working on a whole range of issues to respond to Russia's aggression in real time, and to support eventual accountability efforts. And I want to make one more note in why it's important that we've been focused, particularly in a world where, and particularly in international criminal justice world, where resources are so scarce. And what Prosecutor Khan did by specifically issuing arrest warrants for the crime of unlawful deportation and unlawful transfer of children is a strategic choice. And it's the same strategic choice that we make at the Wallenberg Center to focus on those who bear the most responsibility for unleashing the evils of this war. As Professor Kotler mentioned, the Nuremberg ruling that the war crime of all war crimes, supreme crime, is unleashing. And so I would urge us all to also consider how to most efficiently use our resources and advocacy capacity to hold those most responsible for the aggression, because every war crime that is committed is simply an inevitable follow-up to a war of aggression. The war crimes framework itself deals with military necessity, distinction, and proportionality, but there are no military objectives in Ukraine. And so I would encourage us to also think about the bigger picture as much as possible, because those are the command responsibility that bear the real responsibility for unleashing this war and all of its destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Yonah. We'll now turn to Clint Williamson, who's the lead coordinator on Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group. He was a former ambassador for war crimes in the U.S. and is now based at Georgetown University Law School as the Senior Director of the International Justice. Ambassador Clint, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, great. So what I wanted to do was kind of bridge our panel a little bit back to the one before, which was talking about the web of accountability efforts, and to discuss a bit more about how the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, the ACA, fits into that. But first of all, I want to pick up on a point that Ambassador von Scott made about us bringing Ukrainian prosecutors to Croatia. And what struck me is that it reminded me that today is actually a day that has great resonance for me. Today marks the 32nd anniversary of the first incident, large-scale incident of mass killing in the wars in the former Yugoslavia. On November 20th, 1991, Serbian forces, which had recently occupied Vukovar after a 3-month siege, went into the hospital and took out 250 men and boys, tortured them for hours, murdered them, and dumped them in a mass grave. And it set, what was a horrible precedent for everything that was to come in the former Yugoslavia. I went to the ICTY 2.5 years after that, and this was the first case that I handled, that I investigated and prosecuted. And I spent almost 20 years working on war crimes in the Balkans in a variety of different roles. The last of those was serving as the special prosecutor for the EU in a position that led to the creation of the Kosovo Specialist Court. When I left that job in 2014, I could not have imagined that I would ever be working on war crimes again in Europe. It's not to say that Europe is different from any place else in the world, that they're above this kind of thing. The 20th century in Europe was the bloodiest in the history of our world. But over the last 30 years, since the wars took place in Yugoslavia, we have seen a very different Europe emerge. One where borders have broken down, rule of law has taken root, democratization has prospered. So it is really just surreal that we are dealing with this, that we are confronting the unimaginable in Ukraine right now. What we are seeing is a Russian army that is using atrocity crimes as a tactic of war. This is so embedded in their strategies, and it cuts across all levels of the conflict. From the very beginning, we saw war crimes being committed through the disproportionate use of force, the targeting of civilian facilities. This was clear the first week of the invasion. By March of 2022, the end of March, when Bucha and Irpin and other areas around Kyiv were liberated, we started seeing evidence of crimes against humanity, where civilians had been targeted in a widespread, systematic fashion. Civilians were found with their hands bound, blindfolded, with a bullet to the back of the head. People had been tortured. We started seeing evidence of sexual violence. All of these things were occurring on a large scale. And I'm sure as other areas of Ukraine are liberated, we're going to see more and more of this. As well, there have been compelling indications of genocide. My co-panelists have spoken about this. Yonah talked about it. You've heard it from others earlier today. Clearly, there is incitement of genocide that is going on in Moscow. You hear it in public policy statements of Russian officials up to and including Vladimir Putin, perhaps foremost in Putin. And it makes clear their intent to destroy Ukraine as a nation, something they deny even exists. Arguably the most sinister sort of manifestation of this is the forced transfers and efforts to Russify Ukrainian children. This was brought home to us by these videos we saw right before the break earlier. As horrific as the things that occurred in Yugoslavia were, this targeting of children is a manifestation of evil that is uniquely horrific. The level at which this has happened, the extent to which this has impacted so many innocent people is beyond belief. It is something that we have focused on within the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. My colleague, Wayne Jordash, I think is going to speak more about this in a moment when he talks about some of the work that we're doing in this area. And of course, underlying all of this is Russia's aggression from which all of these crimes arise. So we know that these crimes have occurred. The challenge is how we address them. As we talked about, there are a number of different efforts. As Mark said a moment ago, though, the vast majority of these cases are going to have to be handled in the Ukrainian system. When you look at the history of the International Criminal Court, they're dealing with 16 situations around the world right now. Generally, they have not prosecuted more than 4 or 5 people in any given situation. So even if they double or triple that in Ukraine, we're talking about maybe 15 people being prosecuted. And I think the ICC is intent on going after the senior most people, those most responsible, and they should. That should be their role in the system of complementarity. But that still leaves hundreds, if not thousands, of people that will have to be prosecuted through the Ukrainian system. And so what we're doing with the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group is working with the Office of the Prosecutor General on a day-by-day basis, hand in hand with our Ukrainian counterparts. Our existence is a recognition that there is a breakdown in the international order and that you need to find innovative solutions. Commissioner Reynders and Ambassador von Schaack talked about this earlier. Some of the things that are being done, the myriad of efforts that are ongoing. But the approach that is represented by the ACA is unique. We're actually a consortium of 5 non-governmental entities. The EU Advisory Mission in Ukraine, Georgetown University, Global Rights Compliance, which Wayne heads, the International Development of Law Organization, and Bravo Justice, all implementing a program of support to the Office of the Prosecutor General on behalf of the EU, UK, and US governments. So the rationale for creating ACA was to ensure that these 3 governments would speak with one voice on accountability, and that the government's respective efforts in support of Ukraine could be coordinated. In practice, what this means is that we're bringing experts to Ukraine on a rotating basis. Some people are based there permanently, but working every day with the Ukrainian counterparts. Most of our experts are people that have many years of experience working in the international tribunals, or in domestic systems like Croatia and Bosnia, where war crimes have featured very prominently. Our role is purely advisory. We're not conducting investigations. We're not taking witness statements. We're not collecting evidence. What we are doing, though, is working with our Ukrainian colleagues as they do these things, providing them our expertise based on 30 years of experience in these various courts or in domestic system. Much of our support revolves around general concepts, such as building command level cases, but also in specialized areas such as conflict-related sexual violence, attacks on critical infrastructure, environmental crimes, and crimes against children, which again, Wayne will address in a moment. As Commissioner Reynders said in his opening remarks, there are a number of international efforts ongoing relative to Ukraine, foremost of which is the ICC. So we're very supportive of these efforts. We work closely with the ICC, the ICPA, the JITS, the UN Commission of Inquiry. But again, our primary focus is on these 90, 95, maybe even 99% of cases that are going to have to be dealt with in Ukraine. And just as a last point, I want to bring things back to where I started. As we've seen in the former Yugoslavia, these investigations, these prosecutions will go on for decades. When we took this group of Ukrainian prosecutors to Vukovar over the summer, we went to a mass grave that had just been discovered 32 years after the fall of Vukovar. New evidence was found. New bodies were identified, people that had been missing. A forensic investigation was ongoing. They are still launching prosecutions from that time period. Eli Rosenbaum started his career hunting down Nazi officers and soldiers that had come to the United States that had been responsible for crimes 30, 40, 50 years ago, and even longer, I think. So what we need to recognize is that this is going to require a long-term commitment from us, a long-term commitment from governments, and we very much welcome Canada's willingness to become part of this, to be very supportive of the ACA. This is what's going to be necessary to make this succeed over the long term and to make sure that our Ukrainian partners succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Clint. Now over to Wayne Jordash, who is the managing partner of Global Rights Compliance, a law firm and a foundation that advises governments, civil society, and corporations how to comply with international human rights and humanitarian law. He currently is the deputy to the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group and leads mobile justice teams working with the Ukrainian Office of the Prosecution. Wayne, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak on this very timely panel. I'm going to start with some obvious points. The harm inflicted on children in war is shocking, generally, not just in Ukraine, but globally. Children are amongst the principal victims of war and of violations of human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. They constitute half of those forcibly displaced around the world. They suffer the full range of international crimes, from torture, sexual violence, murder, etc., etc. They are vulnerable to recruitment as child soldiers, and of course that in and of itself entails a huge range of other violations. I start with the obvious because then that begs the question, why is it that this issue, these rights, have been so neglected in international justice? Children benefit from international human rights law, international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and yet, despite these issues being part of the peace and security agenda of the UN, if you look at what's happened in UN fact-finding missions, in international criminal law, over the last 30 years, you will see a huge gap in our approach to this issue. The ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Rwanda, for Rwanda, barely a mention of children's rights, barely an effort to develop practice and procedure which focused on children. Special Court for Sierra Leone, 2001, 2002, the main debate was whether children should be prosecuted who had been forced into conscription in the armed forces. Even at the ICC, the first case of Lubanga, which did focus in on children, and the first case being one of use and conscription of children, the other harm, which was incorporated into that, was not part of that case. The sexual violence that those children endured as conscripted soldiers, not part of the indictment. So I think it's important to both highlight the obvious, but also to highlight the neglect of this issue and to query as a starting point why that is. Why is it that we in the international justice field have for so long ignored or neglected the obvious? Even when there has been a focus on children, it has been in relation to crimes against children, so forced conscription, use of children in the armed forces. But it hasn't been on the more complicated issue, crimes affecting children. And this is a part of what's happening in Ukraine, which we must not forget. Yes, deportations are terrible, noteworthy, and we should, of course, be horrified by it. But that is a small part of the victimization, which is what is happening in Ukraine against and affecting children. Attacks against educational buildings, children being force-fed a diet of propaganda and militarization by Russian occupation forces as part and parcel of persecutory campaigns. What about the children and their special status, orphans, disabled, those who've been separated from their parents? These are all issues which we in the international justice field have not had sufficient focus upon. Consequently, there is a gap in our understanding. This is clear. But it's also clear that Ukraine has to be commended, therefore, for the stance that it's already taken. First of all, for taking the step of the joint order in June of this year, in which was signed by the Prosecutor General, the head of the National Police, and the Ministers for Justice and Social Policy, which foreshadows the implementation of pilot projects throughout Ukraine in relation to child-friendly justice. But more than that, the Juvenile Justice Division of the OPG has been working since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in fact, long since before that. Its work has become incredibly complicated, and this is what the ACA is trying to help the Juvenile Justice Division with. But why I started with the neglect at the international level, it is because that leaves an accountability gap, and it leaves a skill and practice gap. We're all learning what it is to actually seek accountability for crimes against children and crimes affecting children. We have a long way to go, and Ukraine is leading the way. It's often been said about Ukraine being a pioneer, but it is being forced to be a pioneer because the actual case practice and principles turned into practical steps are not there at the international level. So we must work together with the ACA, supporting Ukraine, which is leading the way. And I'm talking about everything from every decision that is made about children must be in the best interest of the child. We must evaluate what that means in relation to each decision. We need specialist units which look at crimes affecting and crimes against children, strategic plans, investigation plans, standardized methods for looking into these crimes, investigating them and prosecuting them. The introduction of child-sensitive systems of prioritization, selection, and aggregation. Ukraine cannot do everything. It must prioritize, it must sequence, it must work out what needs to be done first and approach strategically. All of that needs to be done, and ACA, as I say, working with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office to try to do that with one aim, and I think this has to be our underlying aim, which is to ensure that the full scope of victimization is incorporated into the investigations and prosecutions, because through that, we will then be able to seek optimal accountability, and secondly, we'll be able to seek support, adequate, appropriate support for children, granting the status of victims to children, defining the type of conduct that should be classified as crimes against and crimes affecting children, ensuring that facts do not just slip away as it has in the international field for many years. This is the Ukrainian challenge, and this is the ACA's challenge to make sure that we do our best to support them in this important work, so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past and neglect these issues and neglect the children who deserve more than just our anger and our sorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Now we turn to Eli Rosenbaum, who is at the U.S. Department of Justice, the Counselor for War Crimes Accountability, and the Director of the Human Rights Enforcement Strategy of the U.S. Department of Justice. Eli, over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Rebecca. Good afternoon, bonjour. It's very, very good to be at Massey College today for this important conference. It's a particular privilege to be here alongside, I know we had to walk out, alongside one of the U.S. Justice Department's most important international partners, Ukrainian Prosecutor General Emerita. He is a courageous, tenacious, and I would say visionary leader with whose brave prosecutors we work closely and continuously. The reason I characterize the reasons, many of the reasons why I use those terms in describing him were eloquently stated by Mark in his comments. Under the Prosecutor General's leadership, Ukrainian authorities are doing something that no other country in history has ever done. They're pursuing comprehensive justice for aggression and atrocity crimes while defending themselves in a full-scale war, a full-scale, let's say, ongoing war. I'm pleased to see that some senior members of his team are here as well. Zora, Max, oh, gee, I've done this without a mic. Okay, I've got one. It's a good thing I have a booming voice. Zora and Max and Miroslava are here with him. My team also works shoulder to shoulder with two of my fellow conference participants, Ambassador von Skak and former Ambassador Williamson. And I would like to thank both of them here publicly for the gift of their partnership on major initiatives that we at DOJ have undertaken together in pursuit of accountability for Russia's barbaric ongoing crimes against the people of Ukraine. In our Ukraine accountability efforts, my agency also works closely with the ICC and the EU, and it's wonderful to see that their leading fighters for justice have been here today. Prosecutor Khan remotely, and Commissioner Reinders. Finally, what a joy it is for me to be reunited again, albeit remotely, with my friend Erwin Kotler, Canada's former Justice Minister and and Attorney General, a longtime leader of the human rights movement who's been a hero of mine since I was in law school in the late 1970s. It isn't often that one gets to meet one of their heroes, but it's been both a privilege and a thrill to get to know and learn from Erwin for well over, I guess it's now 40 years. I'd like to briefly summarize what the U.S. Justice Department is doing in this space and then reference some of what I think lies ahead for us. Following the commencement of Russia's full-scale, unprovoked, and unlawful invasion of Ukraine last year, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland moved swiftly to harness the Justice Department's available legal authorities to promote both accountability and deterrence. First, he launched Task Force Kleptocapture to enforce the sweeping sanctions and export restrictions the United States imposed in response to Russia's aggression. That task force has been busy freezing and seizing assets, executing arrests, and bringing prosecutions against those whose criminal acts enable the Russian government to continue its unjust war. Working with international partners, DOJ prosecutors have seized or restrained hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets, including 2 super yachts of Russian oligarchs and others who unlawfully support the Russian regime and evade U.S. Economic countermeasures. We've indicted dozens of individuals accused of sanctions evasion, export control violations, money laundering, and other crimes. Proceeds have been transmitted to our Department of State to be applied for the benefit of Ukraine. And also, during a first trip to war-ravaged Ukraine that Beth Clint and I and others joined him on in June of last year, Attorney General Garland announced the creation of the War Crimes Accountability Team for Ukraine, or WARCAT for short, and he announced his appointment of yours truly to head the team as the department's counselor for war crimes accountability. He declared that day, quote, "There is no hiding place for war criminals." And he added, quote, "The U.S. Justice Department will pursue every avenue of accountability for those who commit war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine," close quote. WARCAT is based in the DOJ Criminal Division's Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section, in which I have served since the section was created in 2010. At WARCAT, the Attorney General's stirring words have been our constant beacon and call to action as we work with our domestic and foreign partners, and especially with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's Office, to pursue justice. To summarize WARCAT's main areas of effort, first, we investigate those alleged war crimes and other atrocity crimes committed during the Russia-Ukraine war over which U.S. courts have jurisdiction, Primarily, this involves incidents in which U.S. nationals have been victims. We have already identified suspects, and our investigative work conducted in partnership with the FBI and Homeland Security Investigations has made significant progress. All I'm at liberty to say beyond that is to quote the old TV series closing line, stay tuned. We work to support our Ukrainian colleagues who will, as a number of the speakers have mentioned, bear the lion's share of the enormous investigative and prosecutorial burdens. This we do principally through case-based mentoring, sharing of evidence, and through provision of training, as the Prosecutor General mentioned, by WARCAT prosecutors and by professionals from multiple components of the Department of Justice, including the National Security Division, the Environment and Natural Resources Division, multiple components of our own criminal division, the Office for Victims of Crime, the Office on Violence Against Women, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. And as we work with Prosecutor General Costin's prosecutors, of course, we learn from them as well. In Lviv, in March of this year, the Attorney General signed a memorandum of understanding with the Joint Investigative Team, which, as you've heard, is a multinational team that has been established at Eurojust in The Hague to assemble evidence of Russia's crimes. It's comprised of representatives of Ukraine, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, and Slovakia. We work closely with the JIT, including through contributions we've made of evidence to its recently launched Core International Crimes database. I might note that to date, the United States is the only G7 country, the only non-European country to have a formal relationship with the JIT. WARCAT also participates. Maybe I shouldn't use a mic. I don't know. WARCAT also still working. WARCAT also participates in the Genocide Network at Eurojust, and we respond to requests for assistance received from the ICC Office of the Prosecutor. This we do in conjunction with the State Department, as was authorized by Congress in legislation that, as Beth mentioned, passed last year and was signed into law by President Biden. In addition, following the Attorney General's announcement that he would appoint an experienced federal prosecutor to serve at the recently established International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, to help build cases to be tried by the planned Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, we've been supporting the work of that prosecutor, who is our criminal division colleague, Jessica Kim. As a number of speakers have said today, the Nuremberg Tribunal declared that aggression is the supreme international crime, the one that typically makes commission of atrocity crimes possible in the first place. Our Attorney General's announcement on this score followed on Ambassador von Skak's landmark announcement earlier this year that the United States supports the creation of the Special Tribunal. I was present at the March 27 conference at the Catholic University of America when Beth made that mesmerizing, historic announcement. I should add on aggression, in 1940, the Kremlin launched a war of aggression in collaboration with Adolf Hitler. The free world responded vigorously. Today, leading free world countries, including Canada and the United States, are vigorously responding to the Kremlin's latest war of aggression. Time doesn't permit me to describe the foregoing efforts in detail or even to identify additional ones in which our WARCAT folks are engaged, but I do want to be sure to express our gratitude to a number of State Department components for their invaluable support, assistance, and partnership. I have in mind especially the office that Beth heads, the Office of Global Criminal Justice, and also the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, INL, the Office of the Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Europe and Eurasia, EUR-ACE. State has many more acronyms, I think, than even we do, the U.S. Embassy in The Hague, and the very brave professionals at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, led by my country's tireless ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink, and supported there by Justice Department Criminal Division and FBI personnel who are stationed in Ukraine. Going forward, WARCAT and our US DOJ partners anticipate continuing and expanding our efforts in pursuit of accountability using the statutory tools and the resources available to us. We will continue our work in support, especially of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office and our other partners, and we'll continue to press and plan for the establishment of a special tribunal on aggression. On the statutory tools front, I might add, and I think Beth mentioned this, the department continues to work in support of the administration's efforts to fill gaps that exist, most especially the absence in the U.S. Criminal Code of a crimes against humanity criminal statute. Alas, although the United States at Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II played a leading role in introducing that offense to world jurisprudence, and though every other NATO country except Italy has that crime in their criminal codes, we in the United States still do not. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco testified this year before the Senate Judiciary Committee at great length on the urgent need to enact a crimes against humanity statute. There are also other legislative changes that would be helpful, very helpful in our work, such as amending the federal torture statute to cover instances in which U.S. nationals abroad are victims of torture. In closing, I look forward to the discussion we're about to have, but I especially look forward to the day when the ghastly war that's been launched by an accused war criminal, Vladimir Putin, a man who leads a UN Security Council P5 nation, when that war comes to an end and when comprehensive law enforcement and compensatory judgment is at last done on behalf of the Russian Federation's countless victims in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. We have about 5 minutes. I want to take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question, and I want to start with Mark Ellis and ask him to expand on this report with Physicians for Human Rights that's coming out December 15th. That's my first question, dealing with the intersection of international criminal law and how we mobilize the medical field. My question to Wayne is, has there been any work on the development of the international crimes affecting children? I thought that was a very, very perceptive point. And what has been done to work with medical people, psychologists, psychiatrists, to look at the trauma, the specific trauma that children suffer during war. I want to ask Ambassador Clint about the atrocities crimes and whether there's any work to be done against atrocity crimes against hospitals, given the report that the ABA is coming out with the Physicians for Human Rights. So I think there's lots of opportunities possibly to work with international medical associations, to mobilize that community, to work with you to show the effects of this war, particularly maybe starting with children. But this report that's coming out with Physicians for Human Rights presents a unique opportunity. And I'm thinking now of some very important books, the book on the criminal prosecution of the Nazi doctors. So that's a big, broad question for each of you in different ways, but I'll put it on the table.
I'll just take 30 seconds because I know we have lots of questions on that. Regarding that particular report, and the December 15th report will be the amendment or the add-on, an additional report that supplements the first one that came out earlier this year. The unique part of this, to reemphasize, is it's one thing to see that you would have a hospital in any particular area in Ukraine that has been targeted. That in and of itself is a war crime. But what was fascinating is when you start collecting and using the technology and seeing evidence not only of one hospital, but you begin to see many hospitals and health centers. And then you connect those dots because there is then a systematic approach to this, what turned out to be a bit of a campaign. It wasn't just a one-off. Our report shows that there's evidence to show that this was a structured campaign in regards to when each hospital was hit, exactly how it was hit, and you bring that all together, and that's when you begin to tell a story. And that story is told through the use of technology and the documentation. That's what's quite unique, and that will be supplemented on December 15th.
Thank you. So it's a very good question, and actually it's a concern of mine, because I think crimes against children are obviously getting most of the attention. The deportation issue is getting, understandably, most of the attention. Meanwhile, I think in Ukraine, I think the regional prosecutors, where a lot of this work investigating is done, are, I think, doing their best to try to record, as part and parcel of other crimes, how this is impacting children. But to be frank, I think they need a lot of resources. They need a lot of more prosecutors. As has been said throughout the day, this is not a war where crimes are incidental. They are integral to the Russian military operation. They want to commit crimes in order to achieve their objectives, which is to extinguish identity. This is why children are being kidnapped and indoctrinated or adopted. This is why educational establishments are being targeted, and so on and so forth. So the task, I think, of recording all the victimization which is impacting children is absolutely enormous. There's not enough prosecutors, and secondly, there's not enough investigators, and thirdly, there's not enough trauma experts to deal with the massive amount of trauma that children are undergoing. In a sense, where children are the most lucky is where their case gets attention from the prosecutor, and then the prosecutors, I think, run around trying to ensure that referral services are brought to bear and the child gets psychological support, and so on and so forth. So they're doing their best, but more support is needed, massively more support is needed to deal with this crisis of crimes affecting children in Ukraine.
Just to pick up on points that Wayne and Mark both made, the attacks that have occurred against hospitals have not been coincidental. Clearly they've been targeted. Luckily, this has not happened on a huge scale, but there certainly have been these attacks. We are trying to help the Ukrainians with collecting the evidence. Again, they're collecting the evidence, but we're trying to steer them in the right direction so that we would be in a position to build these cases. I went out a week after the Russian attack, which occurred last year, invasion, on February 24th. We started meeting with the OPG on March 3rd of last year. One of the first things we told them at that point was, with the OPG, was, look, you need to go right now to the Ministry of Defense. You need to go to the intelligence agencies and make sure that the intelligence information that is being collected for operational reasons is not thrown away when those operational needs have been satisfied. And so, because this is critical to going back and determining which units on the Russian side were responsible for crimes, what the command structure was within those units. And this is something that the Ukrainians have done an excellent job of building these capabilities, having a robust military analysis capability that will feed into these command level cases. And I feel certain that the targeting of hospitals and other civilian protected sites will be a critical piece of this.
Okay, I think it's time, and I want to thank our panelists for a fascinating presentation and hopefully ways forward on this very difficult war. Thank you.